All right, we're going to bring on Gerald Commission. He's the CEO of Todos Medical. We've had the pleasure of talking with Gerald several times before. Let's get him on and get moving.
Hey, how are you?
Gerald, doing well. I know you're joining us audio only today, but great to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
Very good, Gerald. Always a pleasure to have you here. This is one of the several times we've actually been able to have you on All Access. Todos Medical, trading on the OTCQB. TOMDF is the ticker. Gerald, we've got a lot of exciting topics to dive into with you today, but I want to kick things off very briefly. As always, give us a quick introduction to Todos Medical. What is the company all about?
Sure. So Todos Medical started out as a medical diagnostics company with a tremendous AI platform for blood testing for the immune system, specifically focused on cancer. And expanded into Alzheimer's. We acquired a company called Provista Diagnostics and another one called Breakthrough Diagnostics, bringing more traditional technologies forward so that we could then acquire tons of samples and then power that AI to ultimately replace the work that Grail is doing with their test down the line. So we now have, a full service lab called Provista Diagnostics, where we're doing COVID PCR testing, we're doing STI, wound, GI, respiratory, and a few other PCR panels, and we're expanding it to MonkeyPox as the next major source of potential revenue because the U.S. needs to expand. So really, it's been all about testing. And really ramping up PCR testing and testing for cancer. And then we developed a joint venture with a 30-year coronavirus researcher out of Israel. And we've come up with two products for the SARS-CoV-2 protease. One is called Tolavid, which is a dietary supplement that's on the market, not approved to diagnose, treat, prevent, or cure COVID. But many, many people are using it within that context of COVID. And now, especially, our big client base is long COVID. And we have a drug candidate, which is an enhanced version of the supplement, where we've now finished phase 2 trials, and we're in an extension phase in preparation for filing of an emergency use authorization for Tolavir in the treatment of hospitalized COVID, and maybe expanding beyond just hospitalized COVID to other areas of COVID. And we think that the drug will also have applications in long COVID. So, full plate of testing and a treatment subsidiary, and it's been quite busy over the last couple of years as we've built this up.
No, I can imagine. And with the profile of Todos in mind, let's take a quick look at the landscape. I know you mentioned monkeypox earlier. We're definitely going to dive into that, being declared a national emergency just a week ago or so. But let's talk a little bit about the landscape that Todos has had to play in for the last couple of years, right? With the COVID pandemic and everything else. We've had multiple conversations in the past about how this has affected the business, how you treated it, how you came through with the PCR testing and everything else. Where do we stand right now here in 2022 in the second half of the year? What does the COVID landscape look like? How has the company reacted? What's the journey been like up until this point through the pandemic?
Well, if there was one thing I could say is that, relying on our political leaders to do the right thing has been a bad move. And we've realized that now. And so actually we're now more focused on the consumers and the physicians who are focused on protecting themselves, because that's really ultimately where the market is right now. That could change based on the political winds, of course. So I would say we're in a dangerous place. We've kind of normalized 100 to 200,000 infections confirmed by PCR on a daily basis. We all already know that that's, maybe 10 to 20% of what's actually out there in terms of ongoing infections. The infections themselves, interestingly, while not killing as many people, seem to be lasting longer. And even with the treatments that are out there, as we're seeing with President Biden, there's, significant rebound potential. So these infections are lasting longer, keeping people out of work longer. And long COVID is really taking center stage now. As the main problem. People aren't worried about dying of COVID. They're worried about living with long COVID, which is really potentially disastrous. So I would say we're in a pretty dangerous place just on the biology. And then when you couple with that, the policy, just yesterday, CDC released policy, which basically said they don't want people to test in schools. They don't want masks anymore. Even if you're sick, you can kind of still show up and spread the disease. I think we're going to be in for a rude awakening at some point. But there's midterms coming up, And I think that somewhere along the line, some political strategist said, if you keep talking about COVID, you're going to lose. And so right now that seems to be the administration's policy. So, I think it's really up to private business to make the tools available. And I think increasingly, at least in New York, I'm seeing more and more masks everywhere I go. Maybe that's because of monkeypox, but I see that, there's an increasing concerned population that is starting to take extra steps to protect themselves. And that's the market we're going after.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And we were going to save this for a little bit later in the conversation, but I think it makes sense to discuss it now. The same way you're talking about the scene in New York, we're seeing the same kind of thing here in Detroit where we're based, right? We're starting to see some masks come back. We're starting to see the conversations and the chats come up with safety and protecting yourself. And I think the monkeypox certainly plays into that as well. So give us your take on the monkeypox situation as of now. How has it been handled so far? What's the conversation around it? What's your take on the monkeypox situation as we stand here today?
Well, not to beat up on public health too much, but, it's been a disaster. We know that, we saw from the early days of COVID, every single lab in the country had to wait for the CDC to develop a test, and that took forever. And while they were, taking their sweet time doing that, the virus spread. And that's exactly what happened with monkeypox. I mean, the interesting thing about monkeypox is, it's existed for a long time. There are tests, commercial tests that other people are making that have been using for years. And for some reason, unknown to me, we didn't just take those tests and deploy them. We waited 2 months for the CDC to figure out how to do a test. So we missed a huge opportunity to stop the spread. We knew that the virus was really in the gay community primarily. And it's still primarily there, although now, children are getting it, some women are getting it. So this whole notion that it's really just a men having sex with men thing is kind of, it's not true, even though that's where it's been positioned. And so, you combine the lack of available testing, not really a lot of education on the early signs and symptoms to look for, no real plan on isolating people. I even saw something about the CDC saying, if you have monkeypox and you still have to go out, please wear, long sleeves. That's just ridiculous. So it's gotten out of the bag. It's obviously not a huge problem yet. And hopefully, there are drugs, unlike the early days of COVID. There are vaccines, unlike the early days of COVID. Not enough vaccines. And so right now we're in the situation where we need to hypervigilance. There's not enough vaccines to get the necessary immunity required to stop the spread. So that's gone. So we're not going to stop the spread. So what we need to do is we need to identify the spread and we need to treat it. Luckily, there are potentially drugs such as TPOXX that are actually in the market and that could work. And so we need to aggressively expand testing. And we need to make sure that as soon as anybody is diagnosed, they get that drug immediately. And we need to start focusing on exposure and contact tracing so that people can get identified earlier, because what we're finding, not just us, but people in Spain, peer-reviewed articles, and now there's a lab in LA that you can actually identify monkeypox in saliva in asymptomatic people that have been exposed. So you can find people who have monkeypox and don't know it, and if they aren't diagnosed yet, and if you encourage those people to get tested before they have symptoms, when they become even more contagious, then you can give them the drug and potentially slow the spread. I think that's the only option we have. And so ramping up testing is absolutely the number one priority for the country if we want to contain monkeypox.
Got it. And you guys are currently developing a test for monkeypox, is that correct?
Well, correct. So, luckily for us, we've spent the last 2 years developing relationships in the PCR testing world. We actually have an entire division that supplies labs with the necessary PCR reagents and materials and supplies needed to do testing. And we have relationships with manufacturers and suppliers that can give us the necessary pieces of the puzzle to put tests together. And so that's what we've done. We went back to our suppliers that are already in the market with commercial monkeypox tests, and we've identified the best in breed, the most sensitive. And we're in the middle of validating that now so that we can deploy it, not just for lesion testing, but as I mentioned, saliva testing, which is going to be, I think, the only way to really get this thing under control. So that's what we're doing, and we know our stuff works because it's not, we're taking stuff that is working elsewhere in the world and deploying it here.
Okay, so let's take that a step further too, right? Certainly, when you're talking about public health pandemics, you never want to look at this from a business standpoint necessarily, but this certainly is your business, is containing and treating and doing things to prevent or at least mitigate the results and the damages of pandemics like this. With the numbers of monkeypox still being relatively low, especially in comparison to the early days of the COVID pandemic, when you look at this in terms of a market opportunity and the tests that you're going to develop in containing this, do you see this continuing to spread in the same virulent way that the COVID pandemic did? Do you see this being able to be contained if we take different steps from a public health perspective? Or do you think it's already, as you said, out of the bag far enough that this is going to continue to spread and continue to become a pandemic?
Well, listen, it's going to continue to spread. But it's not going to spread anywhere near as fast as COVID, right? So let's all make that clear. With that said, at least the visible consequences of monkeypox are dramatically more significant than COVID. So, many people weren't scared of getting COVID. They called it a cold. I don't think anybody's doing that with monkeypox. So the fear factor with monkeypox is more significant, which, by definition means that there's going to be more people at the earliest signs that are going to want to get tested. And when you combine with that the lethality of it and the areas in which it can be quite significant, there is an opportunity. So, for example, we've seen in many diseases that are looked at in pregnancy that have a very low prevalence in the U.S., but they've become part of a standard panel. If monkeypox continues to spread the kind of way it's spreading, if it gets into children and it gets into areas with young families that have young kids in daycare and maybe pregnant moms at home, we absolutely could see this becoming part of just regular routine prenatal testing. Obviously, as part of the sexually transmitted disease panel type situation, that's clearly the number one way it seems to be spreading, and that's the messaging from public health. So you can imagine it makes a whole lot of sense if you're gonna, if you're a gay person, you're getting an STD test, you should want a monkeypox test as part of that process. And then obviously you have just the run-of-the-mill risk factors of people who, are exposed to people who ultimately end up testing positive with monkeypox. And even if they didn't have a close exposure, right now, the biology, everyone's saying, oh, we really know how it spreads. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure because there are case reports now of it spreading, at low levels, of course, but spreading through money. And it's spreading through aerosols and droplets. How long you have to be there, that's a question. But, in the era of masks, that wasn't a concern. Without masks, that's a concern. So I see a lot of opportunity for this, not just kind of a short-term play, but something that, ultimately could be part of routine testing for a number of things to prevent future pandemics. And with regards to kind of that pandemic discussion, it was California, Illinois, and then New York. And now, the federal government has declared an emergency. So for the federal government to do that just a few months before midterms, that kind of tells you they know they've lost control of the situation.
Understood. And I want to stay on the topic of COVID and monkeypox because you kind of drew some comparisons between how it was reacted to in the early days of COVID and how the monkeypox pandemic is being reacted to in the early days here. But if we stay on the topic of COVID, you guys just released the preprint of your chronic long COVID case study. Can you talk a little bit about the findings there and how it may impact how things are handled down the road with monkeypox? Anything significant to look at there?
Sure. So, like I said, the big difference between COVID and monkeypox is, monkeypox is an orthopox, and there are treatments for orthopox. We understand them quite well. With COVID, the number one treatment out there is Paxlovid, and we're seeing what's happening with Biden. It's maybe not so great. So we see that the challenges with monkeypox are identifying cases. Once someone is identified with monkeypox, they take it very seriously. COVID is a different matter. We've kind of been desensitized to it and take it much less seriously. And that's one of the reasons why we do think it's an opportunity for monkeypox because, numbers of COVID testing have been going down. Even though the numbers of testing have been going down, the numbers of people who have COVID has not. And so those numbers are staying stable. With regards to monkeypox, the numbers are only going to go up, right? And the fear of monkeypox, because of the obvious cosmetic nature of it, and the lifelong scarring that occurs as a result of it, is going to create hypersensitivity among a huge population. So I think that despite some very clear biological differences, the fact that we have a treatment for monkeypox should really drive everybody into gear, because we can stop it. It's possible. COVID, it was basically not possible, but with monkeypox, it is possible. And so that really should be driving, how we're looking at it, because we need a robust response now.
Sure. And talking about a robust response, right? You mentioned earlier how the reaction of the public health department has not been up to par, in your opinion. If you were running the public health response and the messaging and the narrative to people about how to handle the monkeypox pandemic, how would you handle that? What would you change about the narrative? What would you tell the populace? How would you handle this if you were the public health department, or trying to get people to understand this pandemic in the right light?
Right. So first of all, what I would have done is I would have taken those commercial tests and evaluated them to figure out which ones were the ones that were up to snuff. Right now that's being done by CLIA labs like ours. That has not been done by CDC. CDC kind of did that as a clearinghouse, or NCI did that as a clearinghouse for a lot of those antibody tests that nobody ended up using a couple of years ago. That would have been a much better use of resources here. And then I would have identified within each state at least one lab where close to the centers of population where it's spreading in the gay community, where you can get fast turnaround time testing, so that it shouldn't be extraordinary to find a monkeypox test. It should in fact be extremely, extremely easy. And given that we have the COVID infrastructure of testing that, despite it's been kind of dismantled somewhat, it still exists. It's the same labs that are doing COVID testing that are going to do monkeypox testing. So, get the speed with which you can tell people, hey, I can take your COVID test and your monkeypox test all at the same time, get a result, and give you an answer in a few hours. That's the key to stopping the spread. In terms of messaging, the spread right now has been primarily among the gay community. So, in conversations that we have with our experts, the gay community is in fact quite responsive with regards to public health, because they have a lot of experience with HIV. And so obviously a public health messaging campaign initially targeted there, but not limited towards that, where, you say, look, it's not just, sex with men that can cause this thing. It's touching of skin, it's, doorknobs, et cetera. So the whole, what used to be called COVID theater with regards to hand sanitizer and washing your hands, guess what? That's public health 101. That's what we need to be preaching again here, because right now that seems to be the ways in which it's spreading, people touching each other. And so, limiting that and washing your hands and, doing hand sanitizer and that kind of stuff when you're at risk is critical. The whole aerosol and droplet, that's a close contact kind of discussion. And I think, it goes right back to communicating with people, getting them fast answers so that they can then, confer with the people that they know to let them know that they were exposed. So, and the reason why I say that is, the monkeypox incubation is anywhere between 14 to 28 days. Usually within 7 to 14 days, you start to show biomarkers, whether those biomarkers are in saliva or for other orthopox viruses. In blood, you can find monkeypox IgM most likely in blood in the early stages of the monkeypox. The big fear, of course, is a lot of people, you may have been exposed, you don't know you have it, so you don't want to tell everybody in the world that you've been engaged with that you were exposed. You want to wait until you have a confirmation. I think that's the missed opportunity, where if you shorten that turnaround time for the tests, you shorten the turnaround time for people telling other people that they've been exposed, that they in fact have a confirmed monkeypox case, and that those other people were exposed. That was the failure with COVID. You tell someone, well, I was exposed to COVID. Well, everybody's exposed to COVID almost every day in this country at this point. With monkeypox, getting that answer is much more critical.
Understood. And Gerald, as we wrap really quickly too, obviously we spent the bulk of this conversation around the monkeypox pandemic. As we're moving forward here into the second half of the year and closing out Q3 and Q4, anything else that's coming from Todos Medical in the R&D pipeline or the development pipeline that we should be on the lookout for, especially as you guys are addressing monkeypox?
Sure. Well, with regards to monkeypox, obviously the number one thing is completing the validation and getting the assay up and running in the market. With regards to getting it up and running in the market, I've heard from a lot of investors who've kind of compared us to Applied DNA and their ability to get the tests up and running into the market, and that I think is a reasonable comparison. They're in New York, and so they have some more bureaucracy to get the tests up and running. Whereas we're in Georgia, and basically as soon as we've done validated, we can offer the tests. We do have our own validation for the state of New York that is happening in the middle of September. And so, I'll be able to offer monkeypox to most of the country much sooner than that, probably, mid to end of September, state of New York, we should be in a position to offer monkeypox testing. So that's, on the monkeypox side, that's the catalysts coming up. On the COVID side, obviously it's quite significant. Number one, we are obviously are in the market selling our Tolavid product around long COVID, primarily as the target market. Obviously, it's not approved to diagnose, treat, prevent, or cure, but that is the market, and people are seeing success. We recently announced an agreement with a company called Amerimmune, where we are jointly have launched a long COVID panel. And what we're finding now is we are actually seeing not just the symptomatic changes that people are reporting with Tolavid, but we're starting to see fundamental biological changes in the biomarkers when people start to take Tolavid, and that I think is critical because that's where a lot of the subjectivity that people try to infer upon long COVID can kind of be down, kind of goes away, and you can't really disagree with T cell changes, B cell changes, and improvements in other aspects of the immune system. So as we expand the testing, there's the testing revenue around long COVID that we think is just a huge opportunity, because that's the big problem for many long COVID patients. They don't, they're not believed because there's not really a lot of tests. And so, we're the first ones really putting together a truly comprehensive long COVID panel to address all the different aspects of long COVID, viral persistence, autoimmunity, cardiovascular. So that's an area, and having the testing, of course, will drive sales of Tolavid, because if people, can get a test for long COVID, can take Tolavid, and then see changes in their biomarkers and feel better, then that's the ultimate that you would want a drug to be able to do, but it's going to take time for drugs to get through the FDA. So if supplements can have that impact, that's great. And if other supplements outside of Tolavid can be used in combination with Tolavid to address some of the biomarker issues, then that would be great also. And we are looking at, adding things beyond just the Tolavid as part of our offering to be able to address that part of the market. So that, that's where we're going with Tolavid and long COVID. And we are seeing now adoption by long COVID clinics. And we're also seeing adoption into formularies by some of these institutes, including the Institute of Functional Medicine. And so we think that, as long COVID is now starting to be treated by a disease because doctors are starting to understand it better. And those doctors are making recommendations of Tolavid, and we think those are going to be our biggest advocates and our biggest sales force, because the doctors, they want to see their patients get better, and if their patients get better, they're more likely to get more long COVID patients, so it helps their business. So that's Tolavid. For Tolavir, we have a ongoing phase 2 study. We completed the primary aspects of it, and we disclosed the data. It was obviously very, very positive. Now, what we're doing is we're in an extension phase that we've been putting together, and with 46 patients, but our regulatory people are telling us with an additional 10 patients, we could potentially be in line to get an emergency use authorization of Tolavir, our drug candidate, in COVID. And so that's the focus over the next 3 months, get that data submitted to the FDA for an EUA, and then look. It doesn't look like we're gonna have to do that phase 3 study, at least not yet, for Tolavir. And so that's great. That really reduces the potential cash burn that would come out from having to run that. So those are the high level things, and then just from a revenue perspective, we have completed and have launched now our UTI test at our lab Provista. We're almost done with the validations of wound panel, respiratory panel, gastrointestinal panel, and sexually transmitted infection panel. Some of those panels we're actually going to be adding monkeypox to make them more relevant, especially STI for the gay community. So we think that that's going to allow additional revenue to be driven through Provista. So it's all about driving revenue to Provista, expanding the offering, and then ultimately getting ready for our breast cancer test Videssa that'll be out in the market next year. We have started recruiting the clinical trial for the deployment of that test. We expect that to be done in the first half of 2023. And then on the 3CL subsidiary side, on the therapeutics, obviously it's driving Tolavid, working with doctors, proving Tolavid's worth with biomarkers, and then just getting more publications out there and more marketing to drive sales, and then completing the necessary recruitment to be able to get the number of patients to submit to the FDA for the EUA for Tolavir, which then obviously could lead to bulk purchases by governments, and that's just a massive revenue opportunity. So it's very, very exciting over the next several months here at Todos.
Absolutely. Very interesting conversation. A lot to keep an eye on, too. You brought up quite a few topics here that we'll certainly want to have you back on to discuss in the near future. Gerald Commissiong, CEO of Todos Medical, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.